Just 1 hour before the state of Texas was set to end her life, everything suddenly stopped. The execution chamber was already prepared. The witnesses were waiting, and Frances Elaine Newton was already dressed for death. Then, without warning, the governor stepped in and ordered a halt. Not because of new sympathy, not because of protests, but because something about the evidence didn't sit right. There were serious questions about the gun, the shell casings, the forensic tests that were never properly examined. Even one juror would later admit they might have voted differently if they had known what was being hidden. And the most disturbing part? Some of these issues had never been presented in court at all. Frances had been convicted of killing her own husband and 2 young children. But as her execution clock ticked down, a terrifying possibility emerged. What if Texas was about to execute an innocent woman? And if so, how did the case still end with her death anyway? It all began on a quiet evening in Houston, inside a small apartment off Westmount Houston Road. Around 8:27 p.m., police received a call reporting a shooting. When the first deputy arrived, the scene felt eerily still, like time had frozen in place. Inside the living room, 23-year-old Adrian Newton was slumped on the couch, a single gunshot wound to his head. Blood had pooled beneath him, already drying into the carpet. Down the hallway, in the bedroom, their 7-year-old son, Alton, lay in his bed, shot in the chest. There were no signs he ever tried to get up. And just a few feet away, in her crib, their 21-month-old daughter, Farah, had been shot the same way. 3 people were dead, all from close range. What made the scene even more disturbing was what wasn't there. No broken doors, no forced entry, no overturned furniture, no missing valuables. Nothing suggested a struggle. Nothing suggested a robbery. Whoever did this didn't break in. They didn't rush. They walked in, knew exactly where everyone was, pulled the trigger 3 times, and left. Outside, neighbors began to gather under the yellow glow of streetlights, whispering in shock. Some cried. Others just stared at the building, trying to process what had happened inside. But the person standing closest to the apartment wasn't a stranger. It was Adrian's wife, and she claimed she had just discovered the bodies. And from the very first moment, she said something that would haunt the entire case. "I didn't do this." But the way she said it raised even more questions. What stood out to detectives almost immediately wasn't just what Frances said. It was how she said it. She wasn't hysterical. She wasn't shaking. There were no visible tears, no screaming, no collapse to the ground. She stood quietly outside the apartment, arms folded around herself, her voice steady as she explained that she had come home and found her family like this. Detective Michael Perinello asked her to walk through the night step by step. Frances didn't hesitate. She said she'd been at her cousin's house earlier, then decided to return home. When she opened the door, she claimed she knew instantly something was wrong. Before he could even finish his questions, she looked straight at him and said, "I didn't do this." It was an unusual thing to say so quickly. No one had accused her yet. No one had suggested she was a suspect. But Frances had already placed herself on the defensive. Meanwhile, detectives separated her from her cousin, Sandra Nelms, to take individual statements. Sandra seemed nervous, cooperative, but unsettled. When asked about the night, she hesitated, then mentioned something she hadn't thought was important at first. Something about a bag. According to Sandra, Frances showed up at her house unexpectedly that evening. No phone call, no explanation. Just standing at the door, asking her to come for a ride. Before they left, Frances walked over to an abandoned house next door, carrying a blue bag. She went inside alone, stayed for a moment, then came back out without saying a word. At the time, Sander thought it was strange. Standing outside an apartment where 3 people had just been murdered, it felt a lot more serious than strange. And that blue bag was about to change everything. Detective Talton didn't ignore Sander's story. Instead, he asked her to take him back to the abandoned house she had mentioned. It was just a few blocks away on Seeley Street, a decaying place the family sometimes used for storage. Behind the rotting porch, tucked inside a narrow hallway closet, they found exactly what Sander described. The blue canvas bag was still there. Inside it was a small handgun, a .25 caliber Raven Arms pistol, clean, no fingerprints, no obvious signs it had just been fired. But the location told a different story. This wasn't something someone accidentally forgot. It was hidden, carefully placed somewhere no one would think to look. When ballistics tests were later performed, the bullets that killed Adrian, Alton, and Farah were matched to that gun. Suddenly, Frances's story didn't feel so simple anymore. She hadn't just discovered the bodies. She had stopped somewhere first. She had hidden a weapon. Then she had gone back to the apartment and called the police. Detectives began asking the obvious question. If she was innocent, why was she hiding a gun before reporting a triple murder? And things only became more unsettling when they traced where that gun came from. It didn't belong to Frances. It belonged to a man she was secretly seeing. The gun wasn't the only thing tying Frances to a hidden life. As investigators dug deeper, they uncovered details about her marriage that painted a very different picture from the quiet family image everyone had seen from the outside. Frances and Adrian were technically still living together, but the relationship was already falling apart. They were separated in everything but name. Arguments were frequent. Trust was gone. And both of them were seeing other people. Frances had a boyfriend. Adrian had a girlfriend. But the real shock didn't come from the affairs. It came from the paperwork. Just weeks before the murders, Frances had taken out 3 life insurance policies, one on herself, one on Adrian, and one on their baby daughter, Farah. Each policy was worth around $50,000. Their son, Alton, already had a policy of his own. Frances was listed as the sole beneficiary on Adrian's and Farah's policies. Even more disturbing, Adrian's signature on the documents wasn't real. Frances had forged it. She claimed the policies were meant to protect the children's future, but prosecutors saw something else entirely: a timeline, a motive, and a payout that only benefited one person. And when they looked into her past, the pattern didn't help her case. 2 years earlier, Frances had been placed on probation for forgery. A former employer also testified that she had been fired for stealing money from the company. To the prosecution, it felt less like coincidence and more like preparation. But the strongest red flag wasn't about money at all. It was about what happened on the phone the night her family died. The last known conversations Adrian ever had all went through one person: Frances. Earlier that evening, Adrian's brother Sterling had been visiting the apartment. Nothing seemed unusual at first, but around 6 p.m., Frances suddenly asked him to leave so she and Adrian could talk in private. Sterling didn't argue. He said goodbye and walked out. Not long after, the phone rang. It was Ramona Bell, a woman Adrian had been seeing. Frances answered. After a brief pause, she handed the phone to Adrian. Ramona later told investigators she could still hear Frances in the background. Her voice wasn't calm. She was yelling, arguing. The tension was obvious even through the phone. During that same call, Adrian said something that would later feel chilling. He told Ramona he was tired, but he didn't want to fall asleep while Frances was still in the apartment. He said he didn't feel safe with her there. Then came the second call. Adrian's friend, Elaine Harrison, had plans to meet up with him that night. When he called between 7 and 7:15 p.m., Frances picked up again. She told him to hold. He waited and waited. Nearly 45 minutes passed. The line never disconnected, but no one ever came back to the phone. Less than an hour later, Adrian and both children were dead. So the question became impossible to ignore. If Adrian was still alive when that second call came in, what was happening inside the apartment while his friend sat listening to silence? And why was Frances the only one answering the phone? With the evidence stacking up against her, Frances offered a story that shifted the blame away from herself and toward someone no one else could see. She claimed the real target that night wasn't her family at all. It was her husband. According to Frances, Adrian had been involved with a drug dealer named Charlie. She said he owed him around $1,500, and that debt had been hanging over their home for months. In her version of events, Charlie had finally come to collect. She described a life filled with fear, said Adrian was constantly worried, that sometimes when they came home, he would hide under the bed because he thought someone was coming for him. To Frances, this explained everything. A revenge hit, a deal gone wrong, and, tragically, the children were caught in the middle. But detectives couldn't find a single trace of this mysterious man. No records, no witnesses, no known dealer named Charlie connected to Adrian. Even Adrian's own family rejected the story completely. His mother went straight to the media and shut it down in one sentence. "There ain't no Charlie," she said. "She is Charlie." In other words, they believed the drug dealer story wasn't a lead. It was a cover. A story created to distract from the one person who had the means, the access, and the motive. But years later, something unexpected happened. And suddenly, even the people who were sure of her guilt began to hesitate. Years after the verdict, cracks began to form in what once looked like an airtight case. The same evidence that had sent Frances to death row was now being questioned by experts, lawyers, and even people who had helped convict her. The biggest concern centered around the gun. Some forensic specialists argued the ballistics were never properly tested. There were inconsistencies with the shell casings, and new reviews suggested there may have been more than one weapon involved that night. If that were true, it meant the murder weapon might not even be the gun found in the blue bag. Then came the witness that was never called. A neighbor later claimed they had heard gunshots around 7:30 p.m., a crucial detail that lined up with the timeline of the phone calls. But that neighbor was never brought into court to testify. The jury never heard it. Even more unsettling, a relative came forward years later and said another inmate had confessed to committing the murders. The claim was dismissed at the time, but it added to the growing sense that the full story had never been told. One of the original jurors eventually admitted something that stunned both sides of the case. If they had known about the ballistics issues and the missing witness, they might not have voted guilty at all. Public protests began to grow. People held signs outside the prison, insisting the state was about to make a fatal mistake. For the first time,
The question wasn't just whether Frances deserved death. It was whether she should have been convicted in the first place. And just when it seemed like nothing could stop the execution, the governor of Texas stepped in.
In December 2004, just hours before Frances was scheduled to be put to death, the governor of Texas granted her a temporary reprieve. The execution was delayed for 120 days, so new forensic testing could finally be done. For the first time in nearly 2 decades, it looked like the truth might actually come out. But the problem was, by then, the most important evidence had already been compromised. The skirt Frances wore the night of the murders, which supposedly contained gunshot residue, had been contaminated over the years, and without clean samples, new tests couldn't provide clear answers. When the remaining evidence was reviewed, the courts ruled that nothing substantial had changed. The gun was still considered the murder weapon. The conviction still stood. In September 2005, the Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles voted unanimously to move forward with the execution. The very next day, the U.S. Supreme Court denied her final appeal. This time, there would be no more delays. There are only 2 versions of this story, and both of them are terrifying. In one version, Frances Elaine Newton carefully planned the murders of her own family, hid the weapon, created false stories, and spent nearly 2 decades insisting on her innocence before finally being held accountable. In the other version, a woman with a troubled past was surrounded by circumstantial evidence, failed legal defense, and questionable forensics, and was executed for a crime she didn't commit. No confession ever came. No definitive proof ever emerged. And the person who knew the truth better than anyone else took it with her to the grave. Some people believe the system worked exactly as it should. Others believe this case exposed everything broken about capital punishment. Because if Frances was guilty, then justice came painfully late. But if she wasn't, then an innocent woman was put to death, and there is no appeal for that. So the real question isn't just what happened in that apartment. It's how many times the system has been wrong, and no one ever found out.